Good morning YouTube. Today is probably the most important video I'll do. This is the nature of addiction from a 12-step perspective, and in the centre I work at we use this book. So basically this was written in 1938, published in April of 39. They figured out addiction for alcoholism, but I think it's been proved now with various other 12 step groups using the 12 steps that when they figured out addiction for alcohol, they basically figured out addiction. I'm not sure if they realised that all other addictions follow a similar pattern. But for example, Cocaine Anonymous have this as their textbook, and Cocaine Anonymous is a badly named fellowship in that some of the members haven't even used cocaine. It's an all-inclusive drug fellowship. So that's very handy for most rehabs, because if you had one person working through the Codependence Anonymous textbook, and one person through the AA, and one person through the NA, and one person through the CA if it was different, and another person through the Gamblers Anonymous book, and another, you know, you'd end up with a lot of papers to write, and it would be quite interesting. But our papers are essentially written from this book. So, what is addiction? What I'm going to do hopefully later today is do another video on the difference between addiction as viewed from a 12-step perspective versus addiction seen from the more medical paradigm, the physical dependency. And it's my very strongly held contention that physical dependency is not the same as the illness described in this book. So what I'm going to try to do is to look at AA's Step 1 as the expression of the problem and what the words actually mean. And I'm going to try to dip into the book so that you guys at home know that I'm not just making it up. That's quite important to me. So let's have a look for a pen. You'd have thought I'd have done that before, but I didn't. Right, so step 1. Let's just leave that there, shall we? So the wording of step 1 is interesting. It starts off by saying we admitted we were. Now, what you have to understand about how they wrote that book is they got essentially 100 people sober or thereabouts. It's very difficult to tell when someone actually becomes completely sober, because there's various people who are sober at the moment, and some don't maintain that, and some do. But when they got roughly 100 people sober, they wrote the method down in a book. And alcoholics and addicts tend to be people who are quite defiant, dare I say, quite resistant to doing what they're told. So the way they presented the book was in the form of suggestions, and that's what they learned basically between writing it in 1938 and when it was published. They sent it to various people, and certainly if you look at the original manuscript, they toned the language down a bit. Instead of saying you must, they'd say may you, that kind of thing. So what we're really referring to here is the first 100 that got sober, and they're going to tell you what they did, and their hope is that if you want what they've got, if you want a life free of fear and resentment, and a nice life in recovery, that you're going to be willing to do what they did. So it doesn't tend to say you ought to do this and you ought to do that. It usually says we did this and we did that. but they're hoping that the reader will translate that sentence into, well, if I want what they've got, I'm going to have to do what they did to get it. So this is the first 100. They learned that they had to admit on a deep level this illness, that really victims unfortunately don't get sober or clean, because until you can take responsibility for a condition, any condition, you really can't do anything to combat that. And it's the same with other conditions. Say diabetes, for example. If you feel ill, you go to your family doctor, they do some blood tests or whatever, urine tests, they call you back for results, and the doctor says, look, I'm sorry to tell you this, but you're diabetic. There's broadly two main responses to that. One is to say, okay, don't particularly like the news, but I trust what you're saying, just tell me, what do I have to do? And then they would explain, well, it's type 1 or it's type 2, and you need insulin or you don't, and these are the foods to eat or not to eat, and this is where you can find the information to manage what is a chronic condition. Or the other response is to say, sorry, I don't believe you, you know, it's a big conspiracy by Big Pharma or something, I'm not gonna accept the information. And it's the same with addiction or any actual diagnosis. If you think about it, you either accept that you have it and then inquire, what do I need to do? Or you refute or refuse to accept. Where this differs slightly is when people come into the rehab, I'll tell them, look, you really need to diagnose your own illness, because it doesn't actually matter what I think. So I'll pick someone in the group and I'll say, Joe over there, it doesn't matter if I believe that Joe's a real alcoholic or a real addict. It's Joe that needs to be convinced of that, because when he leaves here, he's going to have to continue to take a series of actions which will ensure long-term recovery. And if he does the compliant bit and like the dog in the back of the car, the nodding dog, and complies while he's in rehab, but doesn't fully concede that he has this illness, once he leaves he'll just stop doing it and he'll be back to square one. Because rather like diabetes, addiction is a chronic long-term condition, and there's a way of living which will ensure a continued arrestment of that condition. But if we stop doing the things that we need to do, will relapse. There's no question about that. And the concept of relapse is not just within the 12-step field. You know, or it's quite common in medicine. So, for example, if somebody had a heart attack running up the stairs at work because the lift was broken, after having led a fairly sedentary lifestyle with way too many burgers and unhealthy foods, what's happened is the atherosclerotic plaque, there's been a bit that's kind of come off the artery and clogged the heart up, and then they've had a heart attack. Now, if they survive that, and the doctor explains what's happened to them and says, look, you need to do gentle exercise, that you're going to have to stop eating burgers, and you're going to have to stop, you know, be very careful with fried foods, and you're going to have to try to get something healthy going with walking so many steps a day or a week, and why not take some salads to work? So, having had the children round the bed crying and really serious warning, he says to himself, right, you know, I need to take this seriously. I need to really change my lifestyle, which was what caused the heart attack. And probably for a few years he would be very careful, but human beings being what we are, it may be that one day, and he gets into a routine of making a salad at work at night to take to work the next day, but then there was a break in the routine somehow, and you know, he's called away to work somewhere else on the other side of town, forgets his salad, sees the burger place, and then thinks, well, I could just have a cheeseburger. Pops in, has a cheeseburger, doesn't have a heart attack, but somewhere in the back of his mind, he's broken the spell of health, and then ever so slowly drifts back into the previous lifestyle, and then one day walks into work, the same lift's broken, runs up the same set of stairs and has a second heart attack. You know, that to me is a relapse, because what he's been given is a way to live which will prevent the heart attack, and through a breach in his routine and discipline, he's drifted back, and the same conditions cause the second one. So addiction's like that. Addiction is a chronic condition, and there's things that we need to avoid. So if you're interested, just basically in a nutshell, we need to maintain a fit emotional, mental, spiritual condition. By spiritual, I just mean how you feel in yourself, because if we get uncomfortable, then we will reach for a drink or a drug to fix that. So the 12 steps transform a human being into being a comfortable person. Otherwise, I mean, if you've got 10 or 20 years of habit in the back of your mind somewhere, that every time there was an uncomfortable feeling, you reached for something to fix it, then that will still be there in the background somewhere, and therefore to turn towards healthier ways of dealing with difficult feelings and emotions is part of the package that one needs to make a success of recovery. And that's very much what I teach in the rehab, is how do we manage effectively through non-chemical means of dealing with difficult feelings and emotions, because, you know, people die, and, you know, life's unfair, and, you know, you'll get a parking ticket or a flat tire, and you know, you have to deal with utility companies, and life goes on once you're in recovery. So we need to find a way to manage our emotional life and our condition, to stay comfortable and to be able to cope or withstand the normal problems of life. And that's where the 12 steps come in. Now that's very different from the physical dependency, but we'll get to that later. So this is the beginning of step one, or at least the one sentence summary of step one. We admitted we were powerless. I like to write this in two-tone. Over. So in AA, they just say alcohol. In Cocaine Anonymous, they say cocaine and all other mind-altering substances. So people who just drink, for example, are welcome to attend CA meetings. Somebody who just took codeine or opiates or ketamine, if that's all they did, they're welcome in Cocaine Anonymous. So in the rehab, what we do, we try to be all-inclusive. So we'll say alcohol, drugs, food, sex, could be relationships and codependency, but we'll just shorten it, it's a short word to fit in here. And then I'll say, look, ... if your favourite thing isn't in that list, then just mentally include that. So it could be addictive spending and, you know, Amazon addiction or whatever. But the point is that these just basically are the distraction away from the real problem. This is something I covered in the video for the families and friends of recovering people, or probably even including people that haven't made it to recovery yet and they want to understand this illness, that actually an alcoholic's problem isn't alcohol. You know, a drug addict's problem isn't drugs. If that were the case and you took them away, say during a detox in a rehab, for example, then you'd be taking the problem away and they'd be fine. But it's the exact opposite of that actually happens in reality. If you take someone's drugs or alcohol away, they get worse, not better. Because what it really is, what these really are, is the person's distraction for the real inner problem. And by taking away the drug, alcohol and drugs, what you're really doing is taking the medicine away, and they start to climb the walls with frustration, anxiety and despair. So the problem is what the inner underlying condition is really about, and all these is the ways that we try not to feel that and distract. And there's a brilliant reading in Cocaine Anonymous, the alcohol reading. It says that we're masters at combining and substituting one drug for another in order to get high or in order to get relief from self, and that's very true. So that's the first half of step one. So if you hear someone saying the first half of step one was easy, but the second half was more difficult, this is something that people do tend to say. That dash, I don't know if the green will come out on the board on the video too well, but that dash is the end of the first half of step one, where we're admitting the powerlessness, and then the second half goes like this, and that our lives had become unmanageable. And again, I like two colours because it gives you a clue. So if my car's petrolless, what does it need? It needs petrol. If I'm powerless, what do I need? I need power. If my life's unmanageable, what do I need to make it? I need to find a way to manage my emotional life, otherwise I've got no chance. So there's a real clue in this. Now if you look at the sentence, for me anyway, there's three big key concepts that jump out. One is that we have to admit some things. And what do we mean by that word admit? Well, it's not just a simple admission. I'll explain in a minute, and we're going to admit the powerlessness and the unmanageability. So at this stage, these are probably just words, and we need to know exactly what do we mean by that. And there are a lot of people who've been to fellowship meetings for years sometimes who can't tell me when they arrive at the centre. I'll say, you've been in AA 7 years, how are you with step one? And they say, oh yeah, I'm there, I know what's wrong with me. And I'll say, okay, well, could you just describe it for me, please? And they say, well, I'm powerless over alcohol and my life's unmanageable. And I'll say, yeah, but how does it actually affect you? What's the mode of that unmanageability or powerlessness? And they'll say, well, I'm powerless over alcohol and my life's unmanageable. And I say, look, I know what the words on the step are, but I'm just asking you how do you experience that? How does that manifest in your life? And they'll say, I'm powerless over alcohol and my life's unmanageable. So they've sat in meetings for years, listening to other people's experiences, but they haven't had the opportunity to do something like this and actually have it taught to them to learn this. And this is, incidentally, why I'm so passionate about this stuff, because over 19 years ago I went into a rehab. It cost my dad over £20,000 then, so it was not cheap, and I left after 28 days not knowing what was wrong with me. Now you would think that any rehab would be very clear on the necessity of understanding the problem that you face, because that kind of determines and dictates the solution that you're going to need for that. I hope by the end of this hour you're going to be clear on at least what I believe, and you don't have to agree with anything I say, but at least what I believe that book says about the nature of the illness that we're up against. And I believe it will make sense because I've done this every 2 weeks for nearly 15 years. So the way I came up with this workshop, I'd been in work for a week or two, can't remember now, but I was just there was a spare space on the timetable, and they just sort of threw me in the group and said, do a workshop. And I'm thinking, whoa, so I'm 4.5 years sober, and I'm confused. I'm starting to get a grasp of the problem. And I just said to the guys, well, what would you like to explore today? And then what I'm about to draw, the system of these boxes, just kind of came out, and I've done it ever since. So the number of people that I've taught this to is huge, and it's almost the same reaction every time, which is, wow, I didn't know that. And they could have been going to these 12-step groups for years and not really have made that connection. Some people know, some people don't. The majority probably doesn't. So as I said, I think there's three main concepts within this sentence, and you can look at the sentence. I mean, all of the steps are just a one-sentence summary. It's like a thumbnail sketch. It doesn't hold all of the information of what you need to do, but it gives you an overview of what the step's about in a sentence. That's really all that is. It's a pretty good one-sentence summary of step one, but it's not the whole story. So you can look at the sentence, and because it was written in the past tense, as in it was the first 100 that went through this method, the sentence above it in the book says, here are the steps we took, which are suggested as a program of recovery. So they're going to very much talk about what they did. So you can think that our lives become unmanageable because of the alcohol, the drugs, and the crazy chaotic lifestyle that we live prior to coming into rehab. Having looked at this for years and really investigated, I believe it's the other way around. I believe that my life was emotionally or spiritually unmanageable by me, therefore I needed the alcohol, the drugs, the gambling, whatever it might be, as a distraction. So right away, that's a bit different. The way I actually think about this is that I grew up in Scotland, and as far back as I can remember, I was a very uncomfortable child. So like most people, I can probably remember back to maybe 5 years old or thereabouts. I just remember thinking, why are people so kind of happy about life? I mean, life's hard. I mean, I'm not having a good time. I don't feel that, you know, this is a good thing. It's a painful thing. That was very much my way of looking at life, and I didn't know it at the time, but when I was uncomfortable, I would find myself eating for comfort. So food was probably one of the original distractions I had, going way back to that age, whereby if I was uncomfortable, I would eat. Another one of my distractions was collections. I had collections for stamps and coins and key rings and all sorts of things, and I'm sure that as I was obsessing about something outside of myself, that just gave me a little bit of inner relief. So I now see collections as being a form of distraction, although I didn't know at the time. Another big one for me was at sport. I played football and rugby, did all the athletics at school. We went everywhere in the summer on our bikes. We played tennis all summer long until under floodlights, until God knows at midnight, probably in those days. And on top of all of this sport, I swam 7 times a week. So it wasn't just a bit of sport, it was obsessive sport. Now, it wasn't a conscious thing. I didn't say, oh, I'm really uncomfortable and I feel better when I play sport. It was, well, I just like sport, and it's healthy, so why wouldn't I? So thinking about it now, with the benefit of hindsight, I think I was uncomfortable, and one of the releases of that angst, that inner pain, was sport. Another one was music. I had a very big music collection, again another collection. I used to borrow the vinyl LPs off neighbours and various people, and I found that we used to record them onto cassette tapes, and if you borrowed a vinyl LP and gave it back quick enough, they would let you borrow another one. And so even at 12, 13, I had a massive music collection, but the way I approached it was very much, I'm in this mood and I want to get to that mood, or I'm feeling miserable, I want to stay there, I'll play the blues. You know, so I had music for different things. If I was angry, I'd probably play my first album that I bought in 1980, which was AC/DC Back in Black. So I had music for different moods, and that's how I would select the music. Maybe normal people do that as well, but I can tell you, when I look back, I was an uncomfortable person and I had lots of go-to distractions, the purpose of which was to help me cope. When alcohol came along, 14 or thereabouts, I just thought, oh, this just works the best. So I didn't make so much effort with the other things anymore. That took over as being my number one coping strategy, and then in itself became a problem. In fact, I can give you an outline of my overall using, if you like. If this is time, and I was about 14 when I started, I got into recovery at 31. Then the amount that I used probably to start with wasn't that much, and what I would call the positive effect was really good. I got a good positive effect. What happens is the positive effect starts to tail off using the same amount. So what you do is you increase the amount to cope with the loss of effect. If I extrapolate these lines to the age of 31, I am literally doing everything I can get my hands on, and yet the positive effect, which I would characterize as dealing with fear, I was very ill at ease in social situations growing up, and by the end, if anything, that was in a minus figure, that my addictions were causing me more fear than they were relieving by the end. So if I look at my life, this period was actually quite a lot of fun, when I had a really good positive effect. I felt I was on a level playing field with others, I could relax, I could enjoy life. And this period was very painful, and you can actually tell the amount of pain by the gap in the line. So here I'm thinking, oh, I'll find a way to manage this, to get it to work. Here I'm wondering if I've actually lost the ability to cope, and by here I'm thinking, oh dear, I'm going to have to get some help. So you can actually tell how painful it was. So that's a quick overview of my life, and I would ask you all to consider whether that's your life. The drugs that I took may well be different, the ages may be different, but in general, does that fit for you? So what I'm going to do now is pause the video, and I've always wanted to do that. So I don't know if that fits for you, but let's get into it now. What exactly is this illness? How does it work? Well, the first part is to look at is the physical part, and the part of the book that deals with this is really the early part. So before page 1 even, and this is just a different copy, but it's the same book. Before even page 1, there's there's 2 letters from the guy that ended up writing most of this, Bill Wilson, his doctor in New York. He had to go into rehab, or the equivalent in those days, several times, and Dr. Silkworth explained to him that he had a theory that when alcoholics drink, they're sort of overwhelmed by a compulsion that ends up being beyond mental control. He said it's like an allergy. It's like a manifestation of an allergy. So in fact, I'll just read a little bit. What he says is, we believe, and so suggested a few years ago, that the action of alcohol in these chronic alcoholics is a manifestation of an allergy, that the phenomenon of craving is limited to this class and never occurs in the average temperate drinker. So reading that was actually a relief to me, because I'd done some pretty terrible things when I was drinking, and the fact that someone was saying, no, you're not evil, it's just an illness and it's got definable characteristics which everybody else has as well, and there's a solution to it, was actually a massive relief. I like this bit because this is how the doctor got to this opinion. He says, I do not hold with those who believe that alcoholism is entirely a problem of mental control. I've had many men who had, for example, worked a period of months on some problem or business deal which was to be settled on a certain date favourably to them. They took a drink a day or so prior to the date, and the phenomenon of craving at once became paramount to all other interests, so the important appointment was not met. These men were not drinking to escape, they were drinking to overcome a craving beyond their mental control. So if you needed money to buy booze, if you were an alcoholic businessman and you needed money to buy booze and you were going to make a whole load of money based on some deal or other, you might drink a little bit prior to the deal because of the fear and the pressure on you to succeed in that. But then it wouldn't make sense that you would get carried away with your drinking and not turn up at all. So he's figuring out, no, there's something else going on here. I'm sure in those days they just thought that it was weak will or people drinking to escape. And he's saying, no, there may be some of that going on, but when these guys drink, that once they start, they can't stop. And that's how he's putting this across. After a little discussion about different types of alcoholic, he says, all these and many others have one symptom in common. They cannot start drinking without developing the phenomenon of craving. This phenomenon, as we've suggested, may be the manifestation of an allergy, which differentiates these people and sets them apart as a distinct entity. It has never been, by any treatment with which we are familiar, permanently eradicated. The only relief we have to suggest is entire abstinence. So if every time you drank orange juice all your hair fell out, I mean, it'd be pretty good if I could do that now. I haven't had a haircut for 12 weeks or so. It's driving me mad. But if you took orange juice and all your hair fell out, eventually you would come to the conclusion, man, I've got to start drinking that orange juice. So it's like that with booze. You don't have a disaster every time you drink, but the prevalence of your disasters and the binges and the chaos will increase over the years as this progressive illness takes off. So this is part one of the threefold illness. So part one is the physical allergy, and this allergic reaction doesn't manifest as sneezing or streaming eyes. It manifests as a craving which becomes beyond mental control. So I know that a lot of people might use the word craving to say I'm really craving a particular food or what have you. We're talking about the type of craving where you would neglect a child or steal from your grandma's purse. We're not just talking about a craving in the normal sense of the word. We're talking about a drive to continue drinking or using, which will actually shut down your moral code. And this is what some researchers has said that I've read, that basically addiction gets into the amygdala, which is a primitive processing center, and when the alcohol or the drug goes into the bloodstream, it gets in there and it basically shuts the frontal cortex, where your moral code is, where your ability to think rationally and with empathy for others, it just gets shut down. So this is the physical part of our illness, is that eventually the craving becomes beyond mental control. that's a bit of a mess, but never mind. So that's the physical aspect of our illness, that we have a physical allergic reaction that once we start, we can't stop. And this forms part of the powerlessness problem. There's a lot of people in AA, for example, who understand this, and they'll say, I'm powerless after the first one. Well, there's more to it than that. There's actually two parts to powerlessness. We're powerless before the first one as well, which is why we put it in. So this is one of the things that when people come into recovery and come into the rehab I work at, this is one of the things that they've got to get to grips with, is I need to look at my experience to find out what happens when I take my drug or alcohol, and do I lose control over the amount. And it's not that difficult to recognize it if you have it, because it will have been a feature probably for years. In my own life, it's sometimes useful to look at what happened when you had a craving but you couldn't quite finish the job, and how that felt. So at one stage of my drinking, I was living above some shops, and there was an off license in the shop below, or just very close by, and I would, in those days, I could get a deal of 6 cans of Stella, which was a strong lager, or 5.2%, 500ml cans, for £5. So £5 sterling would give me 6 cans of Stella, which would keep me entertained for an afternoon. I would hope that my partner would bring back some booze for me, so it would have been, hi Claire, did you manage to, it's really nice to see you, but did you manage to get me any special brews? When I think about the selfishness that goes with this illness, it's quite extraordinary. I would actually have been more pleased that the special brews turned up and she didn't sometimes, I'm sure. But so if I'd been drinking in the afternoon, my allergic reactions in force, but it's fairly early on in the progression of my illness, and we had a great year, that first year in that flat before our daughter was born. Smoked a lot of weed. I was doing the clubbing drugs, and it was a lot about music, so I had some decks, vinyl decks set up in the living room. I built a whole decks bar for them to go on, and various friends would bring the records around and we would mix, and it was a very sociable time. It wasn't yet at the isolation kind of drinking. So as the clock, if she didn't bring booze, or maybe sometimes if she did, back after work, as the clock is ticking closer and closer to 11 when the off license closed, I'd be thinking, shall I go to the offie tonight and get some more? No, I might just smoke a few spliffs and, a few bongs, and no, I'll be alright. We'd sit, we'd talk, we had a great relationship, we'd play backgammon, and we didn't have a TV for the first year of that flat. And it was really good. There was the music in the background, Massive Attack or something on vinyl, long play, an album, and we'd be playing backgammon and actually talking, and it was actually quite a nice year there. But as the clock ticked closer and closer to 11, I would start to feel a bit panicked, and I think, well, do you know what? I think I will go down and get some more. So I would go down to about 10 to or 5 to 11, go down to the shop, and sometimes they'd closed and gone home early. So I'd be standing on the pavement, you bastards, it says 11 o'clock on the opening hours, and I'd be seriously considering smashing my way through the door and whether I could get away with it, because they hadn't done what they said they were going to do. That feeling stood on the pavement. When I've triggered my allergy, it's actually very, very uncomfortable, and that explains why we drink the amount that we drink, is that once we trigger the allergic reaction, it's a drive that we can easily ignore. In fact, I would never ignore it, and as the illness progresses, it becomes more and more prevalent, more and more powerful. Didn't particularly notice it in the years I was daily drinking so much as at the end, where everything was on the line for me, and she was saying, I'm going to leave and take your daughter away, and she meant it this time, and after lots of last chances, you know, and I would try really hard not to drink, and I would manage different periods of time at different times. The first drink of going back to drinking is when I would really notice this. So it may be that there's people that come into the rehab, or people watching this who maybe have never really tried to stop. Well, you probably will notice the craving more when you have a period of abstinence and then go back to it. Probably. So this is a physical aspect of our illness, and it just simply means that once we start, we can't stop. Now, if someone recognizes that the drugs or the drinking in their life is causing a major problem, at some point they will decide, right, well, I'm going to assert my willpower to stay stopped. Because if I put one in, it ends up being chaos, so I'm going to try not to do that. This is what then brings up the mental part of our illness. So they call it a mental obsession. I don't actually like that term very much. I think sometimes it can be really in your mind to drink or to use, and it's just relentless in your head. Other times you just come out of sort of a blank spot, and then you find yourself, you're already halfway through a drink. I mean, that's a bit more scary. So there's a kind of continuum of awareness from being an obsession that you're aware of to absolutely no idea whatsoever. I mean, so I prefer the term blank spot, which is also in the book. And the fastest way to get this across, just give you an example. So there was a time when I was 67 days sober, I think, certainly around 60 days, because I relapsed several times at 60 days. And I'd been out shopping or doing something. I came up this road to a roundabout in Aylesbury, and I realised just as I was at the roundabout, oh, it's Thursday night. Aylesbury Newcomers meeting will be on tonight. Shall I go to the meeting or shall I go home? And I've got this memory that it was about going home and watching films, because this is one of the things I did a lot of in early recovery. Probably a bit of a distraction, but I do like movies. So it was in my mind, it was between meeting or films. And I'd probably been daydreaming and listening to music in the car. So I'm approaching this roundabout, and I haven't made my mind up, and I didn't know what to do. And at this roundabout, there's a big church behind it, and my house was to the right and the meeting was to the left. There's a car behind me, I'm feeling hassled, so the car starts going towards the meeting, away from home. Now I'm driving away from home. I think I need to find a place to pull over to make my mind up. In case I go back the other way. So I'm looking for a lay-by bus stop, something to pull into. No chance, there's nowhere to stop on that road. I came round the bend, and there's a big pub car park on the corner, and I think, oh well, I could just pull in there and turn round. So I pull into the pub, turn the engine off, and then I think, I'm a bit early for the meeting. I know what I'll do. I'll go in the pub and have a soft drink, and then I'll go to the meeting. So I walk in the pub, again, my favourite drink, Stella's on draft, pint of Stella please, and I'm literally two-thirds of the way through the drink before I wake up. What am I doing? How did that happen? So there was no intention to drink that I was consciously aware of. It was like I slept-walked into a relapse. And the only time I woke up to it was when it was already too late. The allergy had kicked in and I could feel it was taking hold of me. But if I'd been 67 days sober, there's no way that it was anything to do with the physical part of the illness. This was a trick of the mind. And what we need to see is that however the mind gets the first one in, then it's going to trigger the craving off. And that was just me off again on another 3-4 day kind of relapse binge. And And that was tough for me, because I'd been through rehab, I'd worked really hard, felt so guilty. My dad had bailed me out of various things, and this was going to be the last time he had to give me any money. I hated the idea of being not sort of financially self-supporting. So when I got to rehab, I did some pre-treatment there, and I said to the therapist, look, I really want you to hammer me. I really want to get the most out of this. I want to get value for money for my dad. He's put up with so much, like, you know, really work with me. And I really worked hard for that month. And I tried so hard, and I would go to all these meetings in the first year and really worked at my recovery. So it was a thing of real value to me. So to just throw it away without a moment's thought just doesn't add up. This is how the mind plays tricks on us, and then we find ourselves doing it again. And this is what you don't always hear in 12 steps groups, because they'll say I'm powerless after the first one. Well, we're powerless before the first one goes in, which is actually the greater part of our illness. Another way to describe it, the book uses the word insanity, which is a very kind of strong... Okay, right. Insanity. It's a strong word, and I think the way they mean it is there's a subtle insanity that precedes the first drink. We might be sane and rational in all other concerns, but when it comes to thinking clearly in terms of what I'm about to do with a drink or a drug, that logic is not there. So my mind might, even if I'm already on the way to buy drugs or alcohol, my mind might just say, well, look, it's okay, one won't hurt, it wasn't that bad, we'll stop tomorrow, this time it'll be different, this time I'll control it. With what I know now, it'll be different, or just one last blowout and I'll stop tomorrow. Whatever the excuse is, I seem to buy into it every time, even if 7,320 times I've made the same one won't hurt and I'll stop tomorrow excuse, and then I've ended up with a disaster on my hands. Then the next time after that I'll still use that excuse, and I won't be able to say to, hang on, but this isn't working. I'm not, seems to be what I would describe as an inability to learn from my mistakes. And this is covered from page 23 to 43. 20 pages just looking at one part of our illness. This is how important it is, and it's difficult to see the problem through the problem sometimes, so we have to really reflect on this. Now, what I didn't show you was on page 30 of the book. In fact, I might just do it briefly now. It says that we have to fully concede to the nature of our illness. It says, most of us have been unwilling to admit we were real alcoholics. No person likes to think he's bodily and mentally different from his fellows. So this is how I'm physically and mentally different from, in quotes, normal people. And this theme of body and mind all goes all the way through this book. So I don't like to admit that I'm different from normal folks in my drinking or drug taking habits. Therefore, it's not surprising that our drinking careers have been characterized by countless vain attempts to prove we could drink like other people. The idea that somehow, someday, he will control and enjoy his drinking is the great obsession of every abnormal drinker. The persistence of this illusion is astonishing. Many pursue it into the gates of insanity or death. We learned, so this is again the first 100, we learned that we had to fully concede to our innermost selves that we were alcoholics. This is the first step in recovery. The delusion that we're like other people, or ever will be, has to be smashed. So that's what the bit more meat on the bones of what that word admit means. It doesn't simply mean that I go to an AA meeting and say, you know, my name's Frank and I'm an alcoholic. That is technically admitting I'm an alcoholic, but to fully concede the actual nature of the mechanism of alcoholism is what we actually need as the basis for step 1. And that there is the diagnostic criteria for step 1. I usually put a blue dotted line down here. I don't know if that will come across on the video or not, but that's the diagnostic criteria for being an alcoholic or being an addict from a 12-step perspective. Now, the second half of step 1, we've also got to admit that our lives were emotionally or spiritually unmanageable. So this is the third part, but it's not a diagnostic criterion for being an alcoholic. It just simply means that it may well be the human condition, but our answer to that human condition is to drink and take drugs, or some other distraction. So the third part, let's just put it here, is body, mind and spirit. So we've got, I would call it emotional, or you could call it spiritual illness. The book uses the word malady quite a lot. I think probably Bill Wilson just got bored of writing the word illness all the way through, because it's not technically a disease. If you're interested in that, just Google Bill Wilson, illness versus disease. But I know a lot of people are fond of saying, well, we're diseased, ill at ease and all that. I think Bill wanted to stay on the right side of doctors. So COVID-19 is a disease because it's a communicable entity, but I don't think you can catch alcoholism off somebody by just, being within their vicinity. I don't think it works like that. So technically it's an illness. So the third part, and we've kind of come full circle. When I described growing up in Scotland, I would say that I had a feeling of something's missing. And I would say that, as a simple description, sums it up pretty well. Although, when I couldn't sleep in early recovery, I would listen to a particular Buddhist guy that I really liked, Ajahn Sumedho, and his teachings are Four Noble Truths, and he would talk about the first noble truth of life is suffering, or dukkha, and that it's an empty, restless kind of feeling of lack. So I'm listening to this and thinking, I wonder if he's an alcoholic or an addict. No, it's just the human condition. But so it's not in diagnostic criteria. But if you have these two and you're in recovery and you want to know why we need a spiritual solution, then that's the answer, is that we have an emotional illness which we need to heal. Otherwise, we'll always reach out for a distraction to help us cope. So we've got 3 words from the doctor's opinion. Restless, I guess always uncomfortable, never quite getting to being comfortable. Irritable, which is a great word. So easily annoyed, unusually sensitive. Most of the people that I've worked with, and certainly including myself, very sensitive people, and it's like the effect of life on us is actually so painful that I need something to take the edge off. That's a good way to describe this illness. Discontent just means uncomfortable, I'm guessing. I would add bored, lonely, and anxious. Sorry about my terrible writing. So basically that's going to manifest in different ways for different people, but it's bloody uncomfortable. So what we actually do is, with the 12 steps, we actually treat the spirit of a person we don't actually, the steps on the wall, if you look at the one sentence summaries, they don't treat the physical body and they don't even treat the mind. It might look a bit like that with inventories and things, but this is me describing growing up in Scotland with an empty feeling of lack. And then my wiring as an addict is, well, if I feel bad and I eat and that relieves it, why wouldn't you? That's my logical, my pattern of avoidance is hardwired. And so normal people may feel the sense of dukkha or lack as a human being, but they won't go down the road of drugs and alcohol. Otherwise it would be in the same category as me. So what we do, use the 12 steps to heal this, because if we don't, this just builds up until we're so uncomfortable that the mind says, let's just have one won't hurt, wasn't that bad, we'll stop tomorrow. So the interrelationship's quite important. And what I've done here is I've put page 52. So for example, they give you a little list here. It says, we were having trouble with personal relationships, including with ourselves. I hated myself. Couldn't control our emotional nature, so I was up 1 minute, down the next. A prey to misery and depression. Couldn't make a living. A feeling of uselessness, full of fear, unhappy. Couldn't seem to be of real help to other people. In fact, I hurt them a lot, because my illness would pull me in the opposite direction from my moral code or my sense of my conscience. So this is a painful condition to live in, and so the way we learn it when we get to recovery is we learn the body, and then we learn the mind, and we fully concede to these two parts, and then we look at the third or the second half of step one, which is the third piece, and we realize, yeah, I have solved my emotional pains by taking drugs and alcohol, which then develop these two, and it's become a problem. And we learn that the solution is the 12 steps to become comfortable, because if we don't become comfortable, that temptation will always be there. So the way you learn it is that way, but the way you experience it, so if there's someone in recovery who's not doing enough work on themselves, what will happen is they'll get progressively more uncomfortable to where their mind says, hey, I know how to solve this, just have one. One won't hurt, it wasn't that bad, we'll stop tomorrow, whatever the excuse is, and then they put the first one in, and then it's all bets are off, and they're back on some sort of binge. So this is how I understand the threefold illness of addiction, and the twofold versus threefold debate that goes on in 12-step groups. To me, diagnostically it's twofold, but overall it makes slightly more sense, as long as you bear that that's the human condition, to actually call it threefold. So I hope that was helpful for you today. Thank you.